that we have done for under the EGROW Foundation for the growth process. This is keeping in mind Minister's call of 2047, and we have been discussing at EGROW about 2050 for quite a bit of some time now. As you know, EGROW Foundation is a research-based policy think tank. We believe in research-based policy advice. And during the COVID time, we took special measures to ensure that we are connected, and we brought the best minds across the world to discuss with us about the contemporary issues. During this last 2 years, we have had the privilege of hosting two Nobel laureates as well as maintaining a 50-50 ratio with the speakers from rest of the world and India. It is in that very context that today we have invited Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia to discuss with us about the reforms. For the last 5 weeks, we have been invariably discussing about the reforms in India. Dr. Arvind Virmani himself, the chairman of our think tank, has delivered two talks on the reforms and the reforms process. Today, we will be now listening to Dr. Montek Ahluwalia. To chair the session, Dr. Arvind Virmani will be chairing the session. As you all know, Dr. Arvind Virmani was the chief economic advisor of our country. From 2009 to 2012, he was the executive director at the International Monetary Fund, Washington, representing India and a few other countries. Dr. Arvind Virmani has been with the government from 1987, and before that was at the World Bank also working on reforms. Since 1987 that he has been with the government, he has worked extensively on India's reforms. He has also published extensively in refereed journals and also many book articles and also books to his credit. To chair the session today, we now invite now Dr. Arvind Virmani to deliver his talk before inviting Montek Ahluwalia to make the presentation. Dr. Virmani,
Thank
please.
you, Dr. Charan Singh. It's really my pleasure and privilege to that Shri Montek Ahluwalia is here to talk to us. So what I'm going to do really is to give a kind of personal introduction. But I should, and that really my, you can call it a talk or an introduction. So I hope Mr. Ahluwalia, Montek won't mind if it's a little longer than the usual introduction. But I should warn that, and of course, it's based on my interaction with him. He was my boss for roughly half the time I was in government, which spanned a bit less than quarter century. But I should warn that it's the perspective of somebody who worked for the boss. The boss had many people working for him. He probably had tens of people who worked for him. I was not the only one, but for me, he was the only boss. So it may be a little biased perspective, which I hope Montek will excuse. And of course, he worked with tens of others, not just people who worked for him, but the other people in government, other secretaries which he had to convince about the reforms. And of course, both he and I, of course, there's no comparison, but we met tens of people from business, finance, industry, academics, etc. I mean, mine were probably 1/10 of the kind of people he met. So many of the things which I will say, probably he doesn't even remember. But given that warning and my in advance kind of, apology to Montek, let me give a brief overview of the things which I and worked with him on, of course. There's two parts to it. One is kind of offline or online, you would call it, and the face-to-face while I was a boss. The first part is very brief, but it kind of sets the stage. So this was the period, he was special secretary in PMO and commerce secretary between 1987 and 1991 sometime. time before he moved to finance. And and I was in the planning commission, and I wrote a number of papers, roughly about 5 papers on reforms. And I still have some of them. The original copies, maybe 1 or 2 are missing, but these were, I took the, the advantage or the privilege of sending these papers to all the economists I could find in the government. And of course, Montek was among them. As I said, he may not even remember that these papers included issues of trade, reform, and exchange rate, among which one of them was the dual exchange rate, which is part of the second part of the story. So I mentioned it here. And then again, he may not remember, but he called me on the phone one day and asked me to write a note on an effective exchange rate index. There were the RBI, the government didn't have any EER or NER nominal effective rate index. And he called me up and said, why don't you write me a note on this issue, which I did. So, and I gave numbers to it. That's really the start of my, you could call it, offline interaction with him. The more importantly, from 1991 to 98 roughly, he was Secretary DEA, and for latter part of that time, he was designated Finance Secretary, which just means kind of the senior most secretary in the Ministry of Finance, who is supposed to act as a kind of coordinator of all the other secretaries. So here, I would describe myself as having been during this period as a kind of technical assistant on economic policy and policy reforms to my boss, who was Montek, and of course above him was the finance minister through most of his period, Dr. Manmohan Singh. So basically, from my perspective, I was involved with him on 3 or 4 major reforms and 3 sets of what one might call incremental or stretched out reforms. Let me very briefly give those, and then after this, I'll turn it over to Montek. So first, of course, was the foreign exchange liberalization, which occurred in the 92-3 and 93-4 budgets. I still remember very visually, as I said, he may not even have any memory that he ever even met me in the corridor, but I remember in the DEA corridor, he came up to me, I was walking, and he said, well, you had mentioned this thing about dual exchange rates in your earlier whatever, and can you write me a paper on that? I said, fine. So obviously, the paper meant now operational. It was not just a theoretical paper, that if one were actually going to do foreign exchange reform, how would we justify it and how would we produce it? And I did give him the paper. I recall him reading and giving me comments on it. I don't know how many other people he consulted. I'm sure he sent the paper to many other people before he gave me the comments. Then I gave a revised paper, which then led to the reforms. The second part of that story, I still remember, he told me to go to RBI. So there was a secret meeting before the budget called by RBI governor at that time, Venkatraman. And at that meeting, we resolved some of the practical issues. There were a whole bunch of people. I was not the only one. There were a whole bunch of people from finance, from RBI, etc. And some of the kind of final decisions or recommendations were resolved at that issue. Obviously, the final decision is always the finance minister's. And again, I presume this was sent to the finance minister. The second major reform, which actually occurred over the whole period from 1992 to 2002, I was, again, the description of a technical assistant. I was the one who did the data and analysis of details of tariffs. I don't remember exactly, but I'm sure the Secretary DA helped me get all this data. There were huge amounts of data on my computer on tariffs. And kind of I used to bother him every 3 months or 6 months with the details of what the customs reform should mean. And I still remember once, somewhere in the middle or after 2 years, he told me, why don't you focus on some of the sectoral issues, or focus out. And I got the hint that maybe the reforms that, after the big bang would be better done sectorally. And I remember him mentioning chemical sector, for example. So that was the second major reform where, where I acted as technical assistant to the boss. And the third major one, of course, was the Foreign Exchange Management Act, where, again, I did the conceptual papers. And then I remember that for the first time, he said, okay, why don't you work this out with the JS? There was a JS who was an expert in law, okay, who had done law. And he told me, why don't you work with him to refine this act and reforms? And you will recall all three forms went through. The fourth one, which is kind of in between, I used to give annual pre-budget notes on tax reform to the PM through my secretary, which was Montek for at least till 1988, and then it was Vijay Kelkar. And in the 97 ones, somehow there's a long story behind that, which I may tell later, but somehow Montek was either away on some work or something. So this reform note on income tax reform kind of went up straight to the finance minister, who was Mr. Chidambaram at that time. And then, of course, it was taxation, so it was not directly DA. So presumably, after this interaction the finance minister had with me, it went down to the revenue secretary, presumably, maybe through the finance secretary, I don't really remember, and then down to the CBDT for implementation. But this annual budget notes, I used to bother him, right through this period. Finally, more quickly, two other issues on trade and financial policy is also interesting, where, in fact, I used to be a little bit irritated because my boss, Montek, put me on 75. I mean, I counted them. There were between 75 and 100 different government and RBI committees and other committees on which he nominated me to act as kind of the eyes, ears, and arguer at the level below the secretary on issues of trade, financial policy, and so on. And the part I liked, of course, was as a result of this learning, he also appointed me, of course, the finance minister probably had a role in that, to several PSB boards, UTI board, LICI board, to combine practical experience with my theoretical papers on credit, etc., which I had done earlier. But the good part, of course, that was a good, because one learned a lot from these interactions. I mentioned the interactions earlier. I think that was one great thing which happened under his charge, was this openness to all kinds of ideas and influence. And of course, we had to do our own thinking to decide which was good or bad. And so I used to send him these short notes on various trade policy, financial issues, etc. Again, I doubt that Montek remembers any of them, but it's justified. As I said, he had so many interactions and people telling him. And finally, which is another important element, which is the macro management. So in every crisis, whether it was the BOP crisis or Latin American crisis, Asian crisis, and I think around the time he left, the Pokhran crisis, I don't know if he was there at that time, I've forgotten exactly. But I used to write these, how to manage what are the likely macro consequences of these crises happening across the world, and what, in my view, would be the best way to manage them. Again, I should mention, I was well aware that he had access to many other parts of the government, for example, the RBI, and I'm sure he used to ask them for advice, etc. With that kind of, let me finish with the final. So this is till 98. Then there was a wide gap between our interaction and his next position. He became member Planning Commission, went away to IEO and worked in IMF. And then when he came back as Deputy Chairman Planning Commission from 2004 to 13, we again had this interaction in 2006. And what I remember is that he was very supportive of this UID thing I proposed, which, of course, he was Deputy Chairman at that time. And really the member and member secretaries is where I pushed through these ideas, but he was always supported. So basically, very fond memories of, the reforms. And I always say, I mean, in conclusion, I should say, there were really three, in the 1990s reform, there were three levels or four levels at which the reforms were done. People think looking back, that was so easy, it was damn tough, and when we were in the middle of it. And of course, the 4 levels I always used to include is the Prime Minister, Narasimha Rao, the Finance Minister, Manmohan Singh, and at the bureaucratic level, Dr. Montek Singh, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. And as I said, I always saw myself as a kind of technical assistant on economic policy, where I got a lot of these little things which I've tried to give you a flavor of. My apologies to Montek if that was a little long and kind of boring. But anyway, with that, let me hand it over to you. And I'm sure all of us, all our listeners are looking forward to your talk.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Arvind. By the way, is my voice coming out today? I'm getting a feedback here.
Oh, echo. Oh,
yeah.
Does anybody have that? Please, everybody put yourself on mute. Otherwise, there'll be an echo. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm still getting the echo, but maybe I think what happened was in the middle of this thing, screen went off.
Montek, I think you are switched on 2 devices, perhaps, because your name.
Well, I'm only on 1 device, but tell me what's the best way should I just switch off and go back in?
You are logging on 2 points from 2 devices.
No, there's only 1 device.
Okay.
Okay, so what is the decision?
I can hear you very clearly. I don't think.
Well, thank you, Arvind, for taking me down memory lane. I mean, you keep saying that I don't remember, but let me say I don't remember each individual thing, but I have complete recall of he describes himself as a technical assistant. That, of course, is not correct. But he was, in many ways, the principal economist working on these things. And I'm sorry if you got appointed to 50 committees. In my book, Backstage, I say that at the level of economic advisor, when I first came in, I was under a greatly mistaken impression that the most important thing that I would do was to help write the economic survey. I very soon realized that writing the economic survey is important, but mainly for people outside government. Nobody in government ever read it. If you want to have an impact in government, you just have to become one of the boys. In those days, there were no girls, but one of the boys, and these days also the girls. And the way you do that, particularly if you're a lateral incomer, not an IS officer, I wasn't, he wasn't either. Then you do that by getting into committee, because committee is a very democratic process. And over time, it gives you an opportunity to be heard. And of course, you have to persuade people, because it's not as if anything is top down. And I do think that I've been asked to reflect on the past and talk about lessons. So let me spend a few minutes on that part. I completely agree with Arvind that when we look back on 1991, I mean, it looks as if it was also easy. But actually, we were fighting against established orthodoxy. And when I think about it, 2 things are important. One, I don't think any one person could have got this thing done. The only reason it succeeded was that there were quite a lot of people in the system with sort of similar thinking. Now, it's not surprising that the economists had kind of thinking. At least in those days, the economists were more of a consensus. Today, by the way, that's not true. I mean, if you collect 3 economists together, they all have totally different views on issues of globalization, inequality, etc. But in those days, the feeling was, listen, we need to perform much better than we are doing, because we were slipping compared to East Asia. Of course, we were all aware that we must also be inclusive, must do something. But broadly, the idea was you got to get out of this low growth rate to high growth rate. And if you could do that, then there'd be a lot of money to do corrective things, welfare, etc., etc. And there was a consensus that our poor performance was because of excessive control. And, I wish somebody these days would actually give a lecture to young people what the nature of those controls was. Mainly because I think it was George Santayana, the American philosopher, who said that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. So I just feel people should know how awful the system was, so that it at least doesn't come back in full force. Now, I would say that if one person played a critical role there, it was Dr. Manmohan Singh. Because the economists, I mean, we were all at relatively junior levels, economic advisors, secretary. I mean, these are not the levels where decisions are made, but these are the levels to feed stuff in. Now, if all these fellows have different views, then even the chaps at the top have a bit of a problem. Dr. Manmohan Singh was completely clear that controls are excessive, we are not sufficiently open, we should reduce tariffs, we should liberalize the financial sector, and even the exchange rate. But he was quite willing to argue at what pace, how, and so on. He was not what I would call a big bang reformer, nor am I, by the way. And I think most of the fellows who've done reform in a big bang fashion have really made a mess. But I do feel that we were too slow. And I mean, what we did in 30 years, we should damn well have accomplished in 15. That would have been pretty good. Now, I think one of the big differences is in 1991, everybody refers to Manmohan Singh's 1991 speech as historic. And it's interesting that most people think of the budget speech as making some announcements. This budget speech, you announce this, you announce that, you announce that. From that perspective, the 1991 speech was not historic, because the devaluation had taken place, the EXIM script had been done, the industrial policy had been done, all the big changes had already been announced. What the speech did was put them all together into an intellectual whole. Of course, Manmohan Singh was very much involved in all these things, but the budget speech was not an announcement type of speech. It was a speech that pulled together what had been done in the previous month by a new government and make people understand why it was done. And consistently thereafter, he kept on pushing that line. And, I think we have not had enough of that. And even in that government and later, we didn't have, if you like, a sort of a second 1991 type speech. We didn't have a speech that said, listen, we've done a great job in the last 5 years. Now the challenges are different. It's quite clear that in some areas things have worked and we're going to move forward quickly. In other areas, we announced something, but it didn't get done. So put together a comprehensive picture and breathe a fresh, give a fresh breath to reforms that we didn't do. Now, maybe one of the problems is that, it's easy to do that when you come in and you're a new government and you're facing a crisis. Now, for example, had this been the same government and they just brought in a finance minister who was different, it would have been very difficult for him to say, by the way, what we've been doing is complete nonsense and we're changing course. Even in his case, because it was a Congress government, he didn't want to indicate that this breaking out from the past, but was presented as a natural forward movement. And let me say, how you present it is really your business. I mean, Deng Xiaoping, for example, that greatest reformer of the 1980s, completely overturned Mao Zedong, but never once criticized Mao Zedong. So it's a political decision. When do you come in rubbishing the previous lot? And when do you come in sort of saying, well, they're wonderful, but doing these now, sort of implying that if they were there, they would have done the same thing. So that part I don't mind, but I think we should have recognized that the logic of 1991 was that some other things should be done. I mean, for example, we continue to retain, we take great pride in liberalizing trade, but actually in 91 we liberalized the trade in capital goods and the trade in media. We didn't liberalize consumer because that was a sensitive issue. Okay. Now, sometime around 1998, the Americans sort of said, look, these guys are retaining quantitative restriction on consumer goods. And the only justification for retaining consumer goods restrictions is balance of payments problems. But India's balance payments is fine. We actually ended the IMF arrangement 6 months earlier than necessary. We were originally thinking that we would have to do a second IMF arrangement under what used to be called the ESAP facility, Extended Structural Adjustment Facility. We told the IMF we don't need it. Our opening up to portfolio capital, in which Arvind a big say also, seemed to work. When he came in, balance of payments ceased to be a problem. So the Commerce Ministry wrote to me saying that, look, the Americans are criticizing us in WTO, and they say that under the WTO, you cannot have quantitative restrictions. You can raise tariffs, but you can't have quantitative restrictions unless you plead balance payments ground. So since balance of payments is a finance ministry matter, we want finance to take concurrence that we have a balance of payments problem. I promptly shot off a letter saying that I do not agree that we have a balance of payments problem. You will be undermining interests of India by saying we do. We are going around the world telling investors to invest in India, that we liberalize the exchange rate, that is self-balancing, and we don't have a balance of payments problem. They were very upset. And as a matter of fact, somehow that letter leaked from the Commerce Ministry. And I was told that one of the American discussants over there, WTO, even told the Indian chaps, and what are you talking about balance of payments? Your own finance ministry says that you don't have a balance of payments problem. Now, we should have got rid of these consumer goods import restrictions. It would have given us self-confidence that with a modest duty, you wouldn't get a flood of imports. And actually, this came up for discussion with Vajpayee. The WTO ruled that India must get rid of these things and gave us 3 years to do it, which means up to 2001. And in a meeting, I said, sir, there is no need to wait for 2001. We can get rid of it now. Because we're telling the world that we are, I don't think in those days the word wasn't Atmanirbhar, but we are confident that we can manage. But, Vajpayee also said that उन्होंने 2001 कहा है तो 2001 तक तो चलने. It is only 10 years after the liberalization that consumer goods also got liberalized. The interesting thing is, it didn't lead to a flood of imports. A few things here and there came in. One of the important things, by the way, that came in was golf balls. Because, until 2001, those of you who play golf and are members of the Delhi Golf Club or the Noida Golf Club, remember that you had to pay a lot of money for second-hand golf balls, which caddies would sell to you. Or you begged your friends when they went abroad, KR top flight, Liana, sort of thing. And all that stopped. The amount is negligible, the number of people who wanted it small, and it didn't make any bit of difference whatsoever. So another typical example is the abolition of reservation for small-scale industry. I think also one of those areas that Arvind was a favorite advocate of, but it doesn't make any sense. We had reserved a whole lot of things where we had a clear export advantage. Garments, electronics, toys, all reserved for small-scale industry. I mean, an exceptionally stupid decision. But we finally got rid of the last small scale reservation only, I think, in 2016. And you launched big reform in 1991. And the logic of that reform is you support the small scale by giving them more credit, that, but you don't do it by reserving things for the small scale. We should have got rid of it much earlier. Anyway, I won't go on and on, but there are several such examples that one can give. So I think there are two lessons. Lesson number one, we must have a lot of thorough consultation so that everybody's voice is heard and different people can express their view. Now, of course, for that, the government has to sound as if it's open to listening. And I think nothing can be more important than that. I'm really grateful to Arvind. I think the highest compliment that he gave me in his rather long introduction is that he said I was always open to ideas. No, that doesn't mean that I necessarily agreed with what you said and what anybody said, but I'm open. I mean, this is an important subject. Let's hear different views. I think that as we are becoming a more complicated economy and we are managing the economy in a much more difficult and changing global circumstance, we need to maximize the amount of consultation and inputs that government actually does. And I must say that in some respects, at least in certain areas, it's happening. I mean, for example, I think the RBI in this uh, monetary committee process has kind of become more transparent. I mean, every 3 months, the poor fellows write down, like, this is a growth prediction, this is inflation projection. So 3 months later, you can always look at it and say, you were right, you were wrong. Sometimes they say that inflation is going up, it is going to go down, therefore we're not raise the interest rates. So when the inflation goes up, it doesn't go down. He said, listen, this. The RBI has just put out a consultation paper on fintech. This is again, to my mind, very important that before you make regulatory changes, you put out your proposals for discussion. So I think some of this is happening, but my feeling is we need a much more informed discussion. I mean, there are several think tanks in the country. EGROW is one of them. I guess you have certain areas of interest. It'd be very interesting in each think tank to make a list that what are the consultation items that the government has invited views, and in those of them in which you have an interest, you make sure that you set your response. I would say the same for the other think tanks around. And I think the more of this happens, the more open people in government will be to listen to what is actually necessary. I mean, government has the ultimate right, as Arvind said, the finance minister's final decision making on those some areas. But there should be input. Let me give you a very interesting example during UK, the Lehman Brothers crisis. The Lehman Brothers crisis was clearly a shock. I mean, fifth largest investment bank broke, and the New York Exchange was all kind of screwed up. So we all wondered what the hell happened. Now, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh called a meeting in his office that included Finance Minister, at that time Chidambaram. It included Governor RBI, newly enshrined Subbarao. It included me as Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, and of course, former Finance Secretary, so credibility in this area. It included Rangarajan, who was the chief head of his Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and a former governor and a good friend of the PM. Now, by any standard, you would think that a Prime Minister has called all these guys together. And of course, his own PMO chat, but they were just noting. He's been sufficiently brief. But he suddenly turned to me and said, Montek, where is Raghuram Rajan these days? So I said, sir, he's left the IMF, gone back to Chicago, where he's a professor. He said, why don't you write to him and ask him to send a note on what he thinks we should do. So, that's an inclusive approach to consultation, which was very typical of Dr. Manmohan Singh. And I mean, it was an unusual event. And by the way, it's not everybody agreed. I mean, for example, I was in favor of fiscal and monetary expansion. Raghuram Rajan was opposed to fiscal expansion, more willing to support monetary expansion. Internally, my good friend Shankaracharya, who I think by then had become India's most famous, no, maybe he was still there. He felt that the fiscal expansion is quite unnecessary. He was not in government at that time, but he felt this fiscal expansion is wrong. He still thinks so. So, economics is complicated, and you can clothe different views with a reasonable theoretical basis. And the best thing you can do is whoever is deciding should know that there are options and then make a final decision. So I think that we ought to institutionalize that in whatever ways we can think of. So my first lesson was we need to operate with a broad consensus. I should add, by the way, that is very difficult today. Because when we were handling 1991, it was really the heyday of the market economy. Everybody in Iran believed that liberalization was going to be a good thing. Everybody would be happy, etc., etc., etc. We are criticized by many people today for having fallen into the Washington consensus trap. Now, this is frankly, in my view, nonsense, because what we did was much less than what the Washington consensus jokers would have wanted. It's true that we moved from an extreme control to something much closer to the middle, but we certainly weren't driven by Washington consensus and all kind of. Okay, so the same situation doesn't prevail today, because first of all, those who argued the merit of an open global economy have themselves changed their mind. So today, you don't have as many advocates of an open economy as you used to then. Second, because of the rise of China and the United States feeling that China is a threat, and frankly, I mean, it's not a bad idea for them to be under threat. And the Chinese are themselves saying, our intention is to threaten you, both economically and militarily, and even ideologically, because they have said that, look, we don't believe all this nonsense about democracy. It's just a waste of time. And the Chinese system is much better. So there is a sense of being the threat. Now, interestingly, if China had not become so successful economically, I don't think the Americans would have minded very much. I mean, for example, if we had been more open and other developing countries also more open, and we had taken up some of the market space that the Chinese took up, then the US relative role would have gone down and should have gone down. But many other countries would have improved. It would not have been the case. The US goes down, China rises, practically in a position to threaten the United States or make them feel threatened. So I think in that situation, it's got complicated now with Russia, Ukraine, which makes the Europeans and the Chinese teamed up with the Russians. So the geopolitical fault lines of the world make it very difficult to proceed on the assumption that open globalization and multilateral trade is going to be the way to go. Now, I don't know how this is going to be sorted out. It's very useful, by the way, for any research tank to pose this issue and say, look, what are India's options? I mean, my own view on this is that It is true that global trade may not grow as rapidly as in the past, but I don't think that there's going to be a massive backstepping on globalization. What there will be is a diversification away from China. And while the slowing down of trade can be said to be a disadvantage for India, the diversification away from China is a huge advantage for us. Now, the question is, are we actually in a position to take advantage of this opportunity, or are we going to let it slip? There, you have many questions that you have to ask. Uh, the objectives that the government has set are very clear. Uh, we want to be more integrated with global supply chains. But the question is, between that as a slogan and the policies that are put forward, uh, there can be different views. And for example, it could be argued that if you want to be part of a global supply chain, you should not have raised your own customs duties as much as we have. I mean, I subscribe to that view. In fact, the first vice chairman of Niti Aayog, which replaced the Planning Commission, Arvind, has publicly said that the raising of customs duties was a mistake. Obviously, within the government, there are different views, but then this should be debated. So it's not just one set of people. Quite a lot of people are saying this. What is the better way? Should we have joined RCEP or not joined RCEP? You can make. So I think India's foreign and trade policy will need to chart a difficult course in a world whose characteristics are changing and where geopolitics is also changing. And we cannot get away from the fact that although the Pakistani economy is obviously in bad shape and not really going to get anywhere, we have a nuclear armed neighbor on one side, cannot be relied upon to not have anti-incentives. And we have China in the northern end, and these two are together. So from a security point of view, we have to be aware that this is going to be a problem. Now, this is going to pose some challenges in fiscal management. I mean, I've talked so far on the issues of policy. I feel that, in some respects, we have now much more consensus than we did earlier. For example, nobody says we should bring back industrial license. Everybody is pro private sector. There is some worry that cronyism and some guys become too big, but then that has to be tackled through both tax policy and competition policy, not by putting constraints. We are quite open on foreign investment. There's none of the anti-FDI type movement. We're also we're not preventing the imports of foreign technology by setting up this Make in India. We're inviting people to come, bring their technology, and produce in India. So it's not going back to the 1970s world. But on trade policy, we have reverse direction. So the question to ask is, if our objective is to integrate with global supply chains, and if our objective is to persuade people who are going to diversify out of China, by the way, they're not going to give up China. I mean, China is too important for that. But it's a no-brainer that it will become China one policy. The question is, in how many cases are we going to be that one? And for that, what is it that we need to do on foreign? Let's see what the foreign trade policy in September does. Of course, the trouble is that has never said anything about import duties or about exchange rate. So it's not very clear. I mean, the essence of our foreign trade policy has to be a combination of licensing, positive support, that is the PLI kind of business, uh, uh, remittances for imports that go into export activity, and lower customs duties and a sensible exchange rate. Now, this requires, this is each of these things is handled by different silos in the government, and silos don't talk to each other. So I think somewhere in the government, a composite view must be taken, and this is something that the think tanks can contribute on, and EGROW, I'm sure, is thinking about these things and should in fact think about these things. Now let me, I don't want to go on and on, but let me come back to something about the future. You know, in the end, for some reason, we are not targeting a growth. We have redefined targeting to other methods, like so many $10 economy by something, so on. But I think this thing says that battery is running low, so I need to make sure it doesn't collapse. One second.
Yeah, your voice is breaking a little bit. Yeah.
Well, let me just see why.
Okay, better.
Yeah, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. What was I saying? Trend of thought is lost.
We're
However,
talking about targeting for the future.
yes,
Targeting.
now you know the X trillion economy. I mean, it's overtaken by a pandemic, so I don't think we should worry about it. But now suddenly we have a new target, which is we want to be a developed economy by 2047. The newspapers are buzzing with excitement. You know, I think slogans are very important. And to my mind, you should judge a slogan by whether it evokes a positive response. And I think this one has evoked a positive response. But you know, a slogan then has to flesh out into a quantitative target, and then that quantitative target has to be divided into what are the policies that will achieve it, and what are the programs. Now, my biggest complaint about government in the past 20 years, I'm not talking about just this government. You know, if you call any joint secretary to the government who is in charge of anything, and you tell him that I think our performance in this area is no good, what should we do? He will immediately say we should create a new government scheme to promote something which is cost 100 crores, put in my budget, I'll spend the money with something. Very rarely do they say that the problem is this particular policy is nonsensical and you must change. So I think, frankly, the government is invariably pushed in the direction of programs and expenditure when many of the objectives are better served by actual change in policies which don't cost money. I mean, for example, getting rid of small scale reservation in export sensitive areas is a policy change.
Yeah, we heard the word policy, then I don't know what happened. We've lost his image, but his voice was clear till the end. I don't know what happened.
We'll try to fix
Yes.
it today. Right from beginning, there has been some challenge.
Yeah.
Let me try to fix it. Just a minute.
He has logged in from two devices, so unknowingly or unknowingly. So one has to be switched off.
No, Dr. Ashok was mentioning that, but let me just quickly see
But
what
that
best we
couldn't
can
be.
do.
Now he's completely gone. He couldn't have put off both of them together, no?
No, he's at least we can see him on one.
Oh, you can. I can't see him. Okay.
One is on, but let
No,
me.
that's the one that needs to be shut off then, because I can't see him.
No, but if you
Just
go
a
to the
second.
participant list, both are still on.
Both are still on, exactly. That's
Yes.
that's my worry.
Oh, in the participants, you're seeing two references.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes, there are two.
two Montek
Anyway, you see,
Ahluwalia.
shut off the one that you can see, because I can only see, oh, maybe he appears somewhere else in the thing. Okay, let me go over all the list and see if I can see him.
There
No,
he
I
is.
can't see him at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah, you type MONT, you'll find two
No, but I have to be able to. Ah, there you are, Montek. I can see you now. Okay. Yeah, this is good. But I can't hear you. Just say something. Mute, unmute. I can see you. Can't hear you yet.
He's muted.
Unmute.
Okay, is that any good?
Okay, you're back.
Yeah, okay. So the issue I was raising was that we need much more emphasis on policies and relatively less on programs. And secondly, like for example, one of the big controversies during the UPA 1 and 2, from the Planning Commission, we were pushing public-private partnership simply because the public sector doesn't have the resources needed to create investment on the scale necessary. And therefore, we said that, look, if you want this infrastructure, you better bring in public-private partnership. We underestimated the complexities of that public-private interaction. But then, I mean, people have now understood it better. Hopefully, it's never happened. But, otherwise, I find that for all this to work, one underlying thing is basically the macroeconomic stability. And frankly, if you look at the present situation, the problem is we are taking on many commitments that are of a program type, where lots of money is going to be needed, and each ministry somehow thinks that that is available. Very often, ministries create financing institutions which then provide the money, but that's just another way of expanding the fiscal deficit. I mean, I think it's a very nice article, I forget by whom, on the state, on the power distribution system. If you look at what's happening, the losses, if you take count of the fact that there are lots of receivables, etc., where people are not paying, the losses are huge. And they're all being financed by the Power Finance Corporation and the Rural Electrification Corporation. It's not at all clear that these corporations envisage that the DISCOM will be able financially to make up these losses in the future. So either they're assuming that tariffs will be raised so that they can recoup these losses and repay, or that the state or the central government is going to pay for it. So, if you add up what we need to do, I've done this on a number of occasions, but let me just give you a rough idea of the macro numbers. First, the total size of the fiscal deficit, center and states taken together, is something above 10% of GDP, if you do a full account. And most people would say that, we ought to bring it down to 5%, maybe in a 5-year period. I mean, even that would be higher than in many other developing countries. So you need a turnaround of 5% of GDP on the fiscal deficit, which is a kind of fiscal improvement. But the fiscal improvement needed is not just that. You also have to increase expenditure. And most people think that you certainly need to increase expenditure at least 1% of GDP in health, probably 1.5% of GDP in education, that's 2.5%, probably 1% in research and development, including agricultural research to deal with climate change, that's 3.5%, at least another 1 to 1.5% on public sector infrastructure, center states together. So that takes you to 5%. And whichever way you look at it, you have to spend at least 0.5% of GDP on defense, because we're not spending it. Now, that if you're reducing the fiscal deficit by 5% and you're going to increase expenditure by 5.5%, what you're really saying is that additional taxation and or savings in existing expenditures should give you something of the order of 10.5% of GDP. Now, Sujit Bhalla has written something saying he doesn't agree with the Finance Commission view that there is an untapped 5% of GDP on taxation, in which case either we're not going to be able to spend this stuff, or we're going to keep running huge fiscal deficits which have their own costs, or we will simply have a massive cut in existing expenditures, which are felt wasteful. But I don't see any political willingness to identify anything that's wasteful. In fact, what I see is that increasingly, because of inequality and the desire to increase the welfare state, there are programs to spend more money rather than less. So frankly, if we look ahead, the Prime Minister's objective that we should become a developed country by 2047, that's 23 years or 25 years from now. We are currently at $2,100 per capita. And the current view of what is a high-income country is something of the order of $12,000. So basically, we need something like a six-fold increase in per capita income in 25 years. This can be achieved if per capita income were to grow 8%. Remember, that's capita income. Over the next 25 years, population will also be increasing, though not as fast as earlier. But if you assume that the average growth rate in the coming 25 years will be something of the order of 0.6% on average, then you're still talking about a growth rate of GDP of 8.6% in current prices. And what is the performance so far? Performance so far is that in the 2 or 3 years just before the COVID pandemic, growth rate had gone down to something like 4.5% on average. Today, this year's growth rate is meant to be 7.2% according to RBI, but that is based on a sharp deceleration in the second, third, and fourth quarter. And if you take the average of the second, third, and fourth quarter, it's only 0.5%. So, if you translate the slogan into a quantitative target and then ask yourself, how are you going to achieve it? That's when it becomes interesting. Now, 25 years is a long time. And you can always argue that productivity in India is so low that by acting on total factor productivity, you should be able to get a lot of bang for the buck. But then total factor productivity is all about competitive efficiency, and competitive efficiency is all about policies, and a little bit about programs. I haven't seen enough that would convince me that on the policy side, we know what to do and we are doing it. Most of the times, I see that, well, there is an innate entrepreneurship in the country, and that's good. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we have a credible program. Anyway, that's and I should say that I'm not offering research results. I'm only offering reflections because that's what you asked me to do. And at least half the things I've said, if I had to prove by doing research, I'd take a little more time on it. But since I'm hoping that some of your people will actually get on and do the research, I look forward to that. So thank you for asking me. Thanks, Arvind. Thanks, everybody. Nice to be on this platform. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Great, Montek. You've done exactly what we wanted and hoped you would do. And before I turn to some of our Sharon and others have specific comments and questions, I'm sure I'll bring them in. But there are 4 issues which you raised, which I just want to quickly highlight in a way. So first, you very interesting suggestion that the nature of controls people don't know about, and we should maybe give a talk on that. It actually turns out there is in my 1980 paper in EGROW, I did an actual a huge appendix, if I remember correctly, about 10, 12 pages, where I listed every single reform over the 1980s. So that may give you an idea, but I think it's a good suggestion, which perhaps Charan, you can consider having a talk on what the world of bureaucratic socialism looked like in, let's say, 1980 or something. So that's a very useful suggestion. The second one, was your comment on the layman crisis, which was kind of interesting, though you were giving it as an example, but I can't let it pass because I was the CA at that time. People may have forgotten, but Pranab Mukherjee was the finance minister under who I operated. And I actually gave him a detailed note before this meeting you referred to on what needed to be done. And let me just summarize my basic thing, a part of which was done, but the one when after I left was not done very quickly. So basically, the crisis occurred while I was on the flight from Washington to back to India, and I got this huge shock. And even though I was the CA, I was the macro guy who had to deal with, supposedly, again at the technical level, I had to deal with it. Anyway, so basically the strategy which I proposed, and half of it was adopted. One, it was to meet the immediate, the credit one was very clear, and we were confident from the ministry that the RBI would handle. But on the fiscal front, we did three things. It was basically what I call a simple 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 automatic stabilizers. The decline in GDP meant that tax collections went down. That provided automatic stabilizer. 1/3 expenditures. How expenditure? The very controversial farmers credit forgiveness thing, which I had personally opposed when I was CA, though I was not consulted. I then took that and said, this is the fastest way to inject money into the system. So I went all out. That was my recommendation to the finance minister, that you just go out and get this done. There's no quicker way of putting money into the economy, and it will benefit the rural area. And the third one was 1/3. I said, let us raid for temporarily for 1 year or till the economy recovers this minus whatever it was. I forget exactly the decline in GDP, till we get back onto the trajectory, or more or less onto the trajectory. All this stuff must be reversed, especially the tax thing. I left in 2009, there was no reversal. That is what caused the problem. So I disagree completely with all those people you are saying. I think the whole thing was managed beautifully till I left. I'm sorry to have to say that. But after I left, they did not remove the fiscal incentive. They in fact doubled down. We got these huge inflows of from telecom sector of the what do you call them, the auctions. And they've spent all that in addition to everything. They didn't use it to further reduce, pull back the fiscal deficit. I had warned about this. I'm not talking in hindsight. Before I left, I had warned about it. I wrote an OECD paper. All this is on record. I gave interviews. The second thing I had warned is you must get back to the reform path. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble. The growth will slow down. Anyway, so the question which people may ask is, where were you when the meeting took place? Well, I don't know. It could be any of three possibilities. I don't remember. One is maybe I was not in town. Second, maybe finance minister didn't want to take me with him. Or thirdly, maybe the PM didn't want the CA to be there. I don't know. Okay. The third and fourth are very. I basically agree with you, but with a slight proviso here. Open economy. I think you have rightly said that's a very important issue. But I think the problem I see in this debate so far is a kind of Washington consensus thinking, that there's only 0 and 1. My basic thesis is China is different. Okay, so any policy which has open market thinking policies, everything else which we did, I did, you did, Manmohan Singh did, PM did. I agree for rest of the world. I disagree strongly on issues with respect to China. Again, that's a long debate. I recommend what is called a dualistic trade policy. As you said, the important thing is to debate it. But there is full agreement that by and large, excluding China, I think we must go back to that path, which worked very well, when you and I were there. The second one, where I also, by and large, agree with you that this move more towards programs, and the balance between policy and programs has got shifted. I agree with you 99% on that. I think this policy, and to be a little more specific, I think there is a lack of, I don't know, advice, understanding, whatever, on macroeconomic policies, which have kind of underhand links. It's very clear. Okay, there's too much import of X or Y. Let's do a program on wheat. But this interconnections which require trade policy, macroeconomic policy, which are kind of under the surface, where you have to combine theory, empirical, and intuition are kind of missing. So I agree with you, and I think you beautifully laid out and very succinctly. Thanks for that, actually. The fiscal imperative, which actually many of the issues, broader issues, I've raised in my paper, which is EGROW paper, India Vision 2050, but I did not specifically address the fiscal thing. So I'm very happy that you have raised this. Again, it's a thing maybe, Charan, we can come back to. I think he has put it very nicely, this fiscal issue, which we are not kind of addressed head on. So thank you for that. So with that, let me turn, I think Charan and maybe Dr. Vishal Das have some comments and questions. Charan?
I had one, means I want to thank Montek for such an excellent presentation and agreeing to be at our forum and talking to all of us. And I knew that he'll be able to distill the best lessons and guide us going forward. He's done exactly that, so I must thank him. My question, sir, is that you were at the helm of affairs and you mentioned about the balance of payments. I was at the Reserve Bank of India at that point of time and looking at the situation from that angle. And in that story that you mentioned, the exchange rates were very, very important. And you had to bring in the dual exchange rate at one point of time. I thought that was a great experiment before you unified it. So I was wondering if you would like to share some thoughts on that. The other issue, sir, which was very burning for us, and we were very badly struck, was the capital account convertibility. And as you know, when I was at the IEO 2009 to 2012, this capital account convertibility at the IMF was again a very burning issue. Took us a long time to tell the world, and everybody contributed in it, including Dr. Y.V. Reddy's speech at Hyderabad. So I was wondering if you would like to share some thoughts on these two issues. Thank you.
Well, sorry. No, on the capital account, we had a very considered view that we were not in favor of opening up short-term capital. So the idea was, how do we open up long-term capital, but keep short-term capital? All the crises that had been caused in Latin America and elsewhere was because of short-term capital, and we were just not going to allow it. So we had a bit of a concern about opening up the portfolio. I mean, FDI, we said, look, although there were limits to begin with, but those were relaxed over time. So we never worried about FDI. Next step was portfolio capital. There was a view that portfolio capital can be volatile. He considered this at length internally and came to the conclusion that, volatility in portfolio capital is self-limiting, because if the stock prices fall, they become more attractive and other people might move in. And I think we said what we have to be able to do is to allow capital to move in and out on the portfolio side, and never be in a position where the ability to get out is out. And I think we succeeded in that. And as far as bank lending was concerned, we ruled out short-term lending and limited it to a fixed amount with a strong preference for long-term lending. And that's basically how it worked. And over time, confidence grew. I mean, this is where, we were doing sort of crossing the river while feeling the stones kind of policy, which is what Deng Xiaoping advocate.
Okay, Charan, is there another question or Dr. Vishendas wants to ask? Then we can open it up. Dr. Vishendas, are you
Open
there?
it to Ashok.
Okay, I hope somebody is looking at the questions in the chat box. Maybe we can take up some of those, or somebody wants to raise their hands. Please
Yes,
keep your
I
comments
am.
brief and questions.
I am.
Huh? Yeah.
Yes, there is a question from Devashish Hazarika. Do you support investing on leading sector or simultaneous push in all sectors? What will be your one question? And there is another question by Sabechi Tripathi. Do you think urbanization reform has to be added with current macroeconomic reforms that was missing in 1991 reforms?
What was the first? What was the first thing?
Let me read it. The second one is, of course, on urbanization. And the first one is on, do you support investing on leading sector or simultaneous push in all sectors? What will be your take on it?
You know, when you say support, I mean, if the name of the game is to allow investment, we should be completely generous. If the name of the game is to provide some subsidy, that can only be justified if you take the view that somehow this sector is ripe, it's ready, and it will respond. You cannot have a general subsidy-based fiscal costly support for all industries. It doesn't make any sense. As far as urbanization is concerned, you know, I do think that is a very important area. But unfortunately, it's not an area the central government can take much initiative. I mean, technically, as of today, if any state government wants to do major urban reforms, there's nothing stopping. It can devolve as much power as it wants. The biggest problem with the urban sector is that the property tax rates are ridiculously low. I mean, compared to virtually anywhere in the world, Indian property tax rates are between 10 and 20 times lower than they should be. So there's a lot of scope for raise, and of course there's the fees for services in urban areas being rationalized. The trouble is we have a political system where nobody wants to delegate at the city level. Nobody wants to empower the cities. People want to attract the cities by providing cheap power. That's what the Prime Minister has called the Reverie culture, others call freebies. And none of this is because of central government. I mean, if there was an informed state government which said, I want to do reforms in the state sector, then nothing stopping them. There's not, in my view, there's not enough lobbying. This is another general point that I would.
Yeah, I think that's, I would re-emphasize that point. It's a very important point that many people don't understand that urban really comes under the state. And unless the states decide to do something about their own cities, it's very difficult. And
Exactly.
Absolutely, I think even economy.
Look,
yeah,
there are three areas which keep getting talked about, where I genuinely believe that you had a reform agenda, and the state wanted to do it, it could do it. One is clearly urbanization and urban related issues. The second is clearly agricultural. And the third is electricity distribution.
Second one?
Agriculture. Agriculture. Second is agriculture. And the third is electricity distribution, the entire land state. Now, those who argue that we are not giving enough room for cooperative federalism and all the rest of it, and there may be issues there between the center and the state that can be legitimately raised. But can anyone get up and say that, look here, we have done fantastic things in urbanization, in agriculture, and electricity reform, but the center is holding us back because of this? I don't think there is.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Again, Charan, maybe we could get some state experts to talk on these three things and what the best states are doing. I think we haven't done that. These three sectors get people from the states where they've done something good.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Any other hand raised, or you can raise your hands, there's some way to raise your hand, and if you want to ask a question or make a very short comment. Okay.
Sir, in the
Yeah.
meantime, can I ask a supplement question?
Yes, please.
Sir, you have just mentioned about the reverie culture, the Prime Minister says, and people are calling it freebies. I had one question on this and wanted to know your thoughts. You worked on Punjab extensively just about a year back, and you've done a report and all that. And it incidentally so happens that the Punjab's revenue expenditure, and certainly the salaries are A plus over the others. You must be knowing that. Now, what is your take? And there is now almost a raging debate in our country with the Tamil Nadu finance minister also saying that, look, I'll do the task which has been assigned to be by CM, and that we are contributing about if we are contributing 1 rupee to the center is only returning us 35 paise. Now, in this sort of a rising deficit, Punjab, highest revenue deficit, Punjab, and then Tamil Nadu making such an observation, where would you, with your vast public sector, public policy experience, place this issue of pre-poll promises, which can have an adverse implication on the budget? That's one. The other, sir, the GST that has got implemented. Now, Dr. Virmani has been writing a lot on it. When I was at IIM Bangalore, I was also writing on it and saying that there's something seems to be fundamentally wrong with the GST, the way it has been fixed. Because if you are going to change rates every fortnight or every month, how does a businessman or an investor go ahead with planning his or her investment? So now I'm a little worried if GST Council keeps changing their rates, what happens to the rewards given by the Finance Commission, and what happens to the center-state relationship? Would you have, sir, any views on these two issues?
No, this is, I mean, what the finance minister of Tamil Nadu said is that, look here, you're not giving us as much as we are contributing. Now, the whole object of fiscal redistribution is that richer states will get less than they contribute and poorest will get more. So I'm not aware how you can solve this problem, because if every state gets back and contributes, then what is the central redistribution supposed to be doing? Either you say that the Finance Commission has done a bad job in the sense they use criteria which are not very suitable. I think his real complaint is a more legitimate, and that is that the center has slapped on a lot of cesses and surcharges which are not distributed to the state. If the cesses and surcharges were also made shareable, then there's no logic in my view to cesses and surcharges being separate from the shareable revenue of the state or of the state. So I think that all you need to do is to make cesses completely shareable also. And that's a legitimate point because it creates a loophole.
Sir,
The center can keep levying cesses without raising taxes, and it doesn't have to share them. I mean, for example, on income tax, if it were to levy a 20% cess, a surcharge for whatever reason, it doesn't have to share it with states. I think that's not logical in my view.
sir, when
Okay.
do you?
On the Punjab thing, I mean, there's been changes in government. You have to see how things go. But clearly, many of the very politically difficult things were not did not appeal to the then Punjab government. I don't know what the present government is planning in this area.
Sir, when do you reach the goal of $5 trillion economy, sir?
Wait. There's a hand. K. Sivaram, are you speaking?
Yes, yes, sir, yes, sir.
Okay.
When do we reach the goal of $5 trillion economy, sir?
You know, that's an interesting but a simple answer. Please work out what you think is the growth rate. You are today $2,100 per capita. Allow inflation of 2% in dollar prices. Put in the likely growth rate in per capita income, add that to the inflation growth rate, and keep expanding at that rate, and find out in how many years you will reach 5 trillion. That's the answer. I mean, let's put it this way. You will definitely reach 5 trillion at some point. So this whole idea of, I personally do not think that defining a target in terms of GDP makes any sense. Target should be defined in terms of growth rate. Now that has the following advantage. If you say, I'm setting a target of percent or 8%, then every year you can ask the question, okay, are you meeting that target? And you may slip it in 1 year, but then you say you'll make it up the next year. But if you say I'm going to hit 10 trillion by 15 years from now, there cannot be any debate for another 15 years.
Yeah, just let me kind of elaborate, because this issue keeps coming up. I agree with. Traditionally we have, 75 years, we basically planned in terms of, from an economic perspective, we planned in terms of growth rates. And then, like he said, that growth rate gives you a certain GDP. Now, I'm not questioning the politics of it, because politically maybe it's useful to talk about absolute numbers because the common people understand. But like Montek said, it's really, there are too many other variables like the real exchange rate and so on, which come into the dollar value of thing. The growth rate is very clear and well defined. It's very well defined for India. It's very well defined for everybody. And it's something which we can see and say, did we fall short? What are the reasons? Is it policy, etc., etc.? And one can have a debate which informs the next set of issues. But that is not to criticize the target in political terms. Maybe it is useful for energizing people to get interested in issues of economic growth. Okay, that's fine. But I still remember, I don't know, it was when I went to Korea maybe 30 years ago, I was kind of amazed to find that every day in the papers there was discussion of GDP growth and what was happening to GDP. At that time, our people was totally uninterested. We used to have papers full of plan. What is the plan? How much money you're going to spend? What are the programs? Nobody used to be interested in GDP. In fact, it connects to another earlier point that was made by Montek Ahluwalia, that the emphasis on policy. Those of you who attended our talk in the last few talks that I've given, and if you haven't, go to the EGROW website, that the whole concept of focusing on policies versus program was developed, by us over the 90s or maybe a little before that. Earlier, everything used to be plan and programs, projects, programs, plan. No connection of GDP. How do we get there? What are the policies? What are the institutional changes? There used to be no discussion at all. And for those of you who heard my talk, in fact, I think Mr. Montek Ahluwalia may have had some role that the Planning Commission for the first time under Manmohan Singh created the Development Policy Division, or they called it Development Policy Research, because everybody objected and said, oh, policy everybody does. Why do you need a separate division? Well, nobody did policy at that time. That's why we needed a Development Policy Division. Anyway, okay, Charan, any other questions?
There have been some very interesting questions. One is from Shankar Rao, and he says that, can you reflect on present Atmanirbhar Bharat? Is it an inward-looking policy against to earlier policy of liberalization and globalization? That is one, so probably he has protectionist in mind. The other is it possible to achieve 7% growth in present situation? And then there is still another one. The Atmanirbhar Bharat was somewhere coined by Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya in 1890. Still, India has taken unprecedented, unusual tenure adopting it. So, any comments
Montek,
on
some of
that?
our audience is students also. So maybe
Yes.
if you want to just explain it in simple terms again, because you already covered open economy, etc. Yeah.
Well, that's a tough question, actually. Look, uh, you know, the trouble with slogans is that different people at different times use the same slogan. I mean, for example, if somebody were to say to me, do you want to be self-reliant or do you want to be dependent on the rest of the world for everything? I would say, of course, we should be self-reliant. So you have to be very clear, what is self-reliance? Does self-reliance means no imports? Or does it mean the ability to pay for whatever imports you need? I would say the latter. The idea that we will not import anything is just madness. The idea that we must pay, be able to pay for the imports we need, plus some amount of logical capital flow makes a lot of sense. But even then, you can have an equilibrium. Say you have an equilibrium of 2 percentage points of GDP current account deficit, which is met by moderately stable flows. Okay, that means the current account deficit can be 2% of GDP. In one track, exports will be 10% of GDP, imports will be 12% of GDP, and you are self-reliant. In another track, exports will be 35% of GDP, and imports will be 37% of GDP. You're the same degree of self-reliance, but in the second track, importing a lot more, exporting a lot more. Many people will tell you that the second is probably better. And somebody will say, no, too much exposure to exports means, are you sure that the world is sufficiently stable? That's a valid point. And you have to think about that. That's why you should not be dependent on any one country. But if you can have a dispersed export strategy, as a general rule, the higher the ratio of exports and imports, the more integrated your country is with global technology trends. So therefore, the use of the term Atmanirbhar, meaning self-reliance, meaning no imports, is just wrong.
Thank you. Just to add to that question and connect to your earlier fiscal points, in the BOP crisis, I did a research which showed that roughly every 1% of fiscal deficit translated into 0.5% of current account deficit. Things may have changed, they may have become completely different, but just to illustrate the point that another way to define precisely, if you want to, I wouldn't recommend that, but would be a zero current account deficit. That would also require a zero fiscal deficit. Yet we merrily keep talking about higher and higher fiscal deficits as if that's great because you can spend more money and produce all kinds of great things, which may or may not be true. Anyway, so it all, as Mr. Montek Ahluwalia said, it depends on the definition of Atmanirbhar. And again, I emphasize that there may be words which are useful for some political purpose, but when you come to economic discussions, you have to be very careful. You can't discuss economic policy and economic objectives while clearly defining what we are talking about. I would say that's kind of the professorial point on this. Okay, Charan, we have gone past 5:30, but if there's anything, or should we end it here?
We can take one or two questions. They are in the chat box.
Ahluwalia, I think, is available. So if there's anything useful. Yeah.
So there is one question I thought was good. Any tax reforms with increase in tax base? because I remember even when I'm teaching, this issue comes up about the tax base and people saying why agriculture is still not taxed. So I don't know if Mr. Montek has a view on it, and would it be a expert committee should be there, or would the GST Council be able to do it? Basically asking if there is tax reforms possible.
Well, let me say that it's always a good idea to set up expert committees because they become a way of raising issues so that debate becomes more broad-based. In fact, one of the interesting things in the 91 reforms, in the very first budget, the finance minister Manmohan Singh did not announce any tax. The only tax change he made was a surcharge on corporate tax, sort of slightly anti-reform. But he said, I'm setting up a committee under Radha Tilaya who will make detailed recommendations. And the stuff that Arvind did at the time fed into all those things, what kind of options we have. So I'm very much in favor of periodically set committee. And frankly, I think this fellow, what's his name, Arvind Modi, had produced very detailed report of administrative reforms in the system. In fact, what is missing today is a good discussion of the institutional and organizational structure within which tax reform should be considered. Now that, to my mind, requires major change. For example, in my view, it is absolutely silly to have a central board of direct taxes and a central board of excise and customs. There should be a revenue department which takes an integrated view of both direct taxes and indirect taxes, so that they can also be talking to each other much more than they're doing. That's number one. Point number two, this fellow, what's his name, Partha Shroff, who was the fiscal advisor to the finance minister, he had served as economic advisor to His Majesty's or Her Majesty's Treasury in London. And he had told me that, the way they work the system on tax policy in the United Kingdom is totally different from what we do. We have continued this utterly ridiculous colonial habit of sanctifying budget secrecy. Over there's much broader. Look, you're having a discussion. Mr. Rishi Sunak says, I will lower taxes, but after the situation has stabilized. Liz Truss says, no, we want to lower taxes now. So the debate is happening before the budget. In India, because of secrecy, you never know what the hell they're doing. When the Vodafone tax proposal came, the finance minister, Mr. Mukherjee, by the way, Arvind, at the time of the Lehman Brothers crisis, the finance minister was Chidambaram. He moved
halfway.
December.
Half the crisis was under him, half was Pranab.
Well, the initial meeting that I was referred to was when Chidambaram was there, but he moved out as soon
that's
as
a good
the
clarification. Chidambaram didn't need any assistance from anybody, so I can understand. He wouldn't take me.
I have no idea. I'm just mentioning it. You said Pranab Mukherjee, he came later.
No, thanks for clarifying. Yes,
he was
you're
there
right.
for the budget. Post Lehman Brothers budget was produced by Pranab Mukherjee, and we.
I didn't mean that. I mean GFC. GFC occurred in October, middle of October. So Chidambaram was there for 1 month or 1.5 months only of the crisis handling. That's what I was talking about, not the budget.
Okay. But when you say GST didn't happen.
GFC, Global Financial Crisis, happened in
that
October.
happened in the middle of September, and Chidambaram was the finance minister until December.
No. October was when the Lehman blew up. October.
I can tell you 100% sure, Chidambaram moved from the finance ministry when the terrorist attack happened in November in Bombay.
Okay, that I take your word for it.
That the home minister was changed, Chidambaram moved out, and Pranab Mukherjee didn't come in immediately because for a while Manmohan Singh held the finance ministry job. He then, when he had a heart condition in January, Pranab Mukherjee was brought in as a minister. I mean, that's just
Okay.
actual. It's not. I'm sure
Yeah, yeah.
your interaction with you did exactly what you said to the finance minister. Now, what I'm saying, what were we discussing? I've forgotten now. That's the trouble with these Zoom things, that you move from one to another.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
actually, by the way, this is an interesting discussion. I accept your facts. But the interesting thing was Mr. Chidambaram, till that crisis, had never let me speak outside. I mean, it was implied. I mean, there was no direct order outside to the press. I was left completely alone to do whatever I wanted on the financial crisis after it happened. So you are right about the
That's
dates.
okay. I'm not. I'm not.
I was
defending,
on my own initiative. I was trying to deal with it. Obviously, my stuff also went to the finance secretary, was also concerned, and the secretary DA. They had to manage the situation. The RBI did, etc. But in terms of just, even if we take your exact dates from November mid, let's say mid, I don't remember the exact date, till the budget of the next year was Mr. Mukherjee.
yes.
That is, you
Not,
know,
no, no,
the
no,
previous
no,
budget was already there.
No. Let me correct you again. Mr. Mukherjee, when Mr. Chidambaram left in November, it was Dr. Manmohan Singh who held
Yes,
temporary
yes,
charge.
yes. Absolutely right.
When
Correct.
he went into hospital in January, that Pranab Mukherjee was brought in.
Right.
So you must have been briefing Pranab Mukherjee in the run-up to the budget for the next year. But the point is, the next year was an election year. So the
Right.
budget, all that Pranab did was a big reduction in tax,
That's right.
which frankly, I mean, my view was, please try and do some expenditure in infrastructure. The problem with reducing taxes is very difficult to reverse. Whereas to increase expenditure, you can choke that off a little bit later. But however, that's a minor detail.
Yeah. Correct. No, correct. Again, I accept your correction. I'm confusing. I mean, my notes would go. In fact, I sent email notes to the PM also, which probably his assistants didn't show him. But what I'm saying, my main point here was, I was the CA. I felt responsible. I worked on all these things. And what you are saying is, in some sense, my voice was not heard. I'm sorry to say this.
No, I have no idea, by the way, whether your voice was heard, because your voice would have been heard by the finance minister. So I have no idea.
After there was a finance minister, like you pointed out. Anyway, let's leave that aside.
so
Let's be clear. Just get the rules of the game clear. When the prime minister calls a meeting, calls the finance minister, he doesn't also call the secretary. If the finance minister wants to take an official, he can. And for example, the governor
Just
came.
clarified that Dr. Manmohan Singh was the finance minister in that interim, right? He had charge of it.
Oh, after
Yeah,
during November to January. Yeah.
that's right.
So you must have been sending notes to him.
Anyway, let's leave that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to you were trying to complete, and then suddenly there was a digression on the tax reforms, and you were mentioning about
I
Parthashom
think
and how.
Parthashom made this point that, you know, in the UK, when they make decisions on taxation, they have a lot of experts that are constantly being consulted, including social psychologists who will say, how will the public view it and how should it be presented? And I personally think that, you know, we need to completely revamp the way the revenue system works. At the moment, the tax research unit on direct taxes is separate from the tax research unit on indirect tax. There should be one tax research unit, so that structurally, if the government wants to pay, for example, sensible reform of the GST involves reducing the number of rates and maybe increasing the number of, reducing the number of commodities that are exempted. Immediately, if you do this, people will say that this is unprogressive because many items which are income items have been now taxed, and you are reducing high income rates to a low level, and this is a pro-rich budget. Now, the correct approach is that, look, you should not always be using indirect taxes to serve equity objectives. Equity objectives are best served in two ways. One, through personal taxation, including a direct subsidy for the very poor if you want. And secondly, structure the indirect tax system so that it generates the most revenue, and judge the equity by how you use the revenue. But if you have a separate group doing one and doing the other, this elementary point just doesn't get made. So, I mean, now this is resented primarily because the revenue service is divided into the direct tax guys and the excise and customs guys. They would have to be merged. Seniority issues would be involved. There would be one chairman of the board, not two chairmen. So, I mean, frankly, for this kind of reason, to be stuck with a system that is hopelessly out of date, there's no justification whatsoever. Now, this is not a program, this is a policy. I would suggest that if EGROW is, I mean, you have a former chief economic advisor, so you, as your chairman, you can get the best technical assistance you want. Put out the tax reform in terms of the structure of taxes. Look, whether people like it or not, the investor view is that we are subject to tax terrorism. Okay. Now, why does that happen? I'll give you a reason. The way the tax system works is that first of all, you're pushed to have a high expenditure. Then you are pushed in deficit. So you put an artificially high revenue target. That artificially high revenue target leads to circle-specific targets. So each guy is told you have to have a 25% increase in whatever taxes you levy. Now that is a target. He cannot go back. He can't even go back and say, look, boss, because of the pandemic, I'm not going to raise the targets will not change during the pandemic. So as a result, people say, what if it's my target? I'm assessing you. I don't accept these. Your income is low, expenditure. I'm assessing so much in tax. The hell with it. You can go to court. And invariably, they'll tell you private that, look, you can go to court, you'll win, it'll take 10 years. But meanwhile, I have met my target. Targets are decided by the assessment, not by whether you actually collected tax or not. Now, what is this? Many investors, especially foreign investors, have told me that this is an absurd system. Now, I don't know who would defend this system. I mean, you know, generally when you have the farmer interest, worker interest, somebody, this is just a revenue department interest.
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Ahluwalia that the institutional reform. Just want to add one or two small points. Arthur Shom, of course, there was a committee and he gave a report on the reforms or structural reform. Of course, he was the advisor to revenue and he also headed, I think, an internal committee of the either the finance ministry or the revenue department, which gave a whole report. Modi, who you referred to, also produced, in a sense, the final report on the direct tax code. So yes, both those things are very relevant. And Modi was
nothing has happened. Nothing has happened on that report.
Yeah, quite right, quite right. Yeah. So on the other point, sorry to have interrupted you. I've checked the dates. You're absolutely right. Lehman blew up in September 15. So for a month, 2.5 months, Chidambaram was finance minister till 30th November. And roughly 1 month after that, Manmohan Singh had charge of the finance ministry, and Pranab Mukherjee was appointed on 24th January.
Correct.
So the facts, as you put them,
I must say, I'm impressed
correct.
with the advantage of having a smartphone and being able to check on Google.
Yeah. That actually allows you to check very quickly. and confirm. Thank you. No, I'm glad you corrected my chronology, which I am probably losing my mind faster than you are. So thank you. Okay, Charan.
No,
Yeah.
I just, sir, it's a great occasion, and I'm so happy that we have an opportunity to discuss these issues. And with hindsight, anything can be correct or wrong. One can have the advantage. But, sir, just wanted to know one thing. Me and Dr. Arvind Virmani were at the IMF when the Vodafone happened. And Pranam came back after that budget to make a presentation at Brookings. And the whole room at Brookings was wondering how could you do Vodafone. And this is going to impact India for years to come. And Pranab Mukherjee defended his, and we all know he had an elephant memory. He defended his decision and said this and that. But then looking back and now listening to you, is it possible that Vodafone decision, which was so retrogressive, was taken without consultation and without consultation of experts like you, as well as
No, I
without
was
consulting
concerned. Let me clarify, interrupt you for a second. You know, one of the most unsatisfactory things in these budget consultations, and Arvind used to sit in on some of those as chief economic advisor, and he'll bear me out. People would come and make their suggestions. We never gave any feedback because of this secrecy nonsense. You could not, even when the chat was saying something that is silly, you were not able to say, but Ari, how can you say this? Because let's just give away that you're not going to do it, right? Now, in the case of Vodafone, Pranab had paid me the courtesy or the compliment as deputy chairman that I want your views. So you please come and tell me what are the things I should do in the budget. I went there, I had a meeting, all his officials were there, and I gave a few pretty obvious types of suggestions. But then I said, sir, there is a rumor going around that you are going to reverse Vodafone decision by a retrospective amendment. And my respectful view is please don't do it. It'll be a disaster. And I've said this in my book, Backstage. So the proposition that he was not advised is wrong. And whoever took the matter forward, after all, he was calling the deputy chairman of the planning commission, not just a casual conversation. So somebody must have recorded that in this game, this is what he said. 3 or 4 useless things, and this will be a disaster. But the problem really with our system is that there's so much secrecy. You know, having been invited to the consultation, I obviously didn't want to ask anyone, even the PM. I hope they haven't done that, because that would amount to privileged information. I was in the cabinet when the budget papers were placed, and I hastily looked at them, at his speech. Speech doesn't even mention it. But in the memorandum, somewhere there, it was there. Now, the real disaster is not just, I can understand that somebody said that this is the wrong decision and we should just reinterpret it. Did anyone brief him that the change in law with retrospective effect open up 20 other cases? Because that's what it did. It wasn't just Vodafone. Because every other case where some sale, etc., had taken place got reopened. Did anyone in the revenue department tell him, sir, it's a brilliant thing. We'll get so much money from Vodafone and we'll get so much from these other cases? No. I mean, incompetence with which that is handled is appalling. And most of our tax kind of initiatives are full of similar kind. Look at the GST. I mean, for example, you know, if you're charging for a pizza, then if it's a takeout, it's one rate. If it's an hotel, it's another rate. If you're taking the pizza separately from the topping, then the rates are different. I mean, who invented this nonsense? This is where, if you had, I don't know what the NIPS is doing. They are the only technically specialized in the think tank on taxation. But you know, they're a government-funded think tank, and therefore you cannot really expect that they will raise these issues. We actually, industry should be doing a much better job. But the trouble is, industry has not seen fit to set up one truly independent think tank. What they set up are their own association, which obviously only make their own case. I would have thought that, you know, it doesn't, I mean, you guys know how much it takes to run a run an independent institution. I would have thought that given the importance of tax policy, that Indian industry would have set up a world-class tax research institute, which would basically become the source of all knowledge on these subjects.
Thanks. Yeah, let me, I'm provoked. Sorry to say this, I agree. Charan, hold on. You've forgotten. We have a paper, a comprehensive, detailed paper on GST reform, where we had at least 20 pages of Excel files with all this stuff in it. So we have a proper paper. And just for your information, to follow up on what you just said, you know, we gave a presentation to ASSOCHAM. FICCI and CII were not even interested in a presentation. You are saying that they don't have a think tank. They had no interest.
Who was this?
FICCI and CII. I think Charan wrote to both their secretary generals to ask them whether we can make a presentation and get their feedback so that we could improve the paper. Not interested.
Well, it tells you something.
Yes, but I can tell you, I don't want to go into detail, but in the government, they did invite me to make a presentation. Of course, what has happened or not happened, I won't comment on.
But Charan, can I ask you to send me that paper?
Sure, I will do.
Email it to me.
Sure, we will do. Now, sir, before you go, and I know we are getting late, but when would such a environment be there? Now, you were at the thick of things and you were there. This issue has come up repeatedly in my classes. I've been teaching at IIMs and even otherwise. The tax base issue. People still feel that the tax base issue has not been addressed even 75 years after independence. Once upon a time, it was justified that agriculture should be out, but should it continue to be the blanket?
I'm very clear about it. There is no justification, in my view, for agricultural income to be completely exempt from tax. If you are concerned about the poor farmer, you can have a schedular system for taxing agricultural income, where the system will be zero for the first so many lakhs, and after that, you have a different rate. Now, what I mean is that on the one hand, people say that the Indian farmer earns only about whatever 20,000 rupees. 93% of them earn 20,000 rupees a year. So if you were to say, since the income tax for the first 5 lakhs, you're exempt. So if you introduce a schedular rate for agricultural income, the real problem is people will say, how do you report it? Doesn't matter, because you're not really trying to get the middle caps. You're trying to get the fellows. First, certain people who own orchards are declaring large incomes from orchards, which is really recycling black money. So if they're themselves declaring it and it's tax-free, then you put on a tax on it. What's wrong with it? So I think that the base issue, the other point which is valid, which no politician is willing to, it is completely ridiculous for a country whose per capita income is approximately 1,20,000, something of that kind, per capita. It's completely absurd to have all tax exempted up to the first 5 lakhs. You know, nowhere, if you were to find out at what point does income tax begin in most countries, and express that income as a percentage of that country's per capita GDP, and take an average and find out on that basis what should be the taxable income. People should get into the tax rate earlier than you do. But our chaps take pride in saying, I have raised the tax hundreds of times, finance minister said, and with that, I'm raising the minimum level. And as a result, so many lakh people out of the tax system. And the whole of parliament applauds. Nobody gets up and says that this is structurally wrong.
This is a very good point. I'm glad we are having this discussion, Charan, because he's reminding me of some great things which I've forgotten myself. In fact, we did a paper, World Bank's first paper on linking exemptions to per capita GDP with my division chief at that time, Jerry Seacat from the Philippines, where we showed this. But thank you very much. I mean, one forgets all these things because one is not working on it. So yes, that's a very, very important point, that the way to compare exemption levels is really to the per capita GDP. I mean, whether you want to set it at 2 times or 3x, we can discuss afterwards. But just doing it in the air is not the way to do tax reform. Thanks, Montek, for reminding us. Yeah.
The last point, sir. I'm aware of the time. The last point, if you can, please. So disinvestment basically started during your time in the power, and I used to be at the Reserve Bank and trying to figure out how are they going to sell the Navratnas and all that. My question is, sir, the privatization of banks, because Congress was in power when they were nationalized both in 1969 and 1980. But disinvestment was being discussed. Privatization of banks was never discussed. And I was wondering why not? Because after 1980, you must have also noticed that, well, they didn't succeed much in banking penetration. In the meantime, it was also understood that with digitalization and internet banking, which had already started, and handheld devices had already started much earlier, around 2000, why was privatization of banks not discussed either in Planning Commission or in the Finance Ministry, or they were discussed but not publicly mentioned in any way?
Very good point. In my view, privatization, at least while the Congress or the UPA were there, privatization of the banks was a no-no. Okay, I mean, I personally felt that we should do some of it, but I don't think disinvestment of banks any. I mean, fine, you get some money, but if the joint secretary in the finance ministry is controlling the banks, the idea that by disinvesting you will get better performance is just absurd. Because the only fellow that the chief executive listens to is whoever the finance ministry guy is on board. Now, why that was not a political decision, but I mean, nobody wanted to waste their time on something that would go nowhere. BJP, the present government has said they will privatize the banks, but there are going to be problems because they've chosen 2 banks they say they want to privatize. See, one of the difficulties with privatization is that I don't think you will get a person willing to buy a private sector bank if you are going to hold a large minority stake. Because, the truth of the matter is that if you have 25% stake, you can pretty much, hobble the management from any kind of initiatives that they want. In order to hand over a bank, one of the problems is that you can only privatize a bank among eligible people whom the Reserve Bank will regard as fit and proper. Now, if you're doing a negotiated deal, that is, you're sitting with some chaps and saying, go pay this, then you go to the Reserve Bank and say, I want to sell my stake to this guy. Is he fit and proper? And the Reserve Bank says, okay. That's one. If you're going to have a bidding process and give it to the person who bids the highest, nobody is going to bid without the assurance that he'll be allowed to get a banking license. I don't know how they're going to handle it. My other point here is that much more important than privatizing is to get rid of dual control. See, at the moment, the nationalized banks are subject not only to the RBI's control, but also to the control by the finance ministry. As a result, RBI does not do a good job of controlling these banks. Look, when there's the slightest suspicion about what is going on in a private sector bank, the RBI can step in and remove the chairman. Okay, you can't do that in the public sector bank. They can only write letters to the finance ministry saying we are concerned about this, we're concerned about that, etc. I think that the finance ministry has no worthwhile role to play in controlling banks. Banks will be regulated by the RBI. And somebody, I think, Nayak, EJ Nayak, who was joint secretary in finance when I was secretary, and later on became chairman of Axis Bank. He wrote a report in 2015, just after the NDA government came in, what can we do with banks? And he was the one who said, look, for all the government shares, holding company, let that holding company explain things to government. Let the banks have nothing to do with the government, just have to do with the holding company. Let the holding company be managed by professionals of high repute. And let the board, let the holding company or the board of the bank, which would have representatives from the holding company, choose the chief executive with no ACC approval by the cabinet committee on appointment. I think it's a brilliant idea, and I have supported this all the time. Nobody wants to let go. So I think the privatization, this is more elementary thing. If you're serious about improving the performance of public sector banks, do this.
Sir, I have one observation, Virmani sir, if you will permit me to ask.
We have
You
to
have
now,
been in the you have been in the planning commission. Mr. Montek was there in the planning commission. Both of you, I do not know, I've never asked any one of you this question. How do you feel with the planning commission going away, and has it helped in the reform process? And will it be, do you feel that it was time, it was already aged enough, it was time for it to go, and now the reforms have taken an impetus and taken us very ahead? Or do you think, or do you feel 8 years after it has gone, that the absence of planning commission is being felt more than anything else?
You want Arvind to answer that? Or you want
no,
me to
first
answer
you
that?
go, I'll finish off and conclude the discussion.
All right. No, you see, I'm first as a factual matter, I must tell you that Dr. Manmohan Singh already said to us in UPA that we must rethink the role of the planning commission because the world has changed and you mustn't keep on doing the same old thing that you guys think about. We had a big discussion with the members. We didn't actually reach complete agreement, but I mean, I had prepared a note for the Prime Minister saying quite categorically that the commission should do different things. That's point number one. It should not engage in detailed budgeting of expenditure in each sector. It should concentrate its attention on some of the critical sectors only. And in those, it should focus as much on policy as on program. In the past, the main role of the planning commission was seen as determining the budget allocation. When you say determining, technically, we were only advising the Prime Minister. The executive decision to put the budget together was that of the Finance Minister. But the Deputy Chairman would send a proposal to the Finance Minister. And since the Finance Minister knew that the Deputy Chairman would be lobbying with the Prime Minister also, there was some narrowing of grounds. But then the rest decided by the Prime Minister. He would call Mr. Chidambaram and me and say, okay, now where are you disagreeing? And these are the areas where now ministries knew that we would be involved in the final determination of the budget. Therefore, they took the planning commission very seriously in terms of turning up for meetings. Doesn't mean that they followed the policy recommendations we put forward, but they sort of took the thing serious that our committees want. Now, I felt all the time that it is more important that we should focus on policy. An example in the context of energy policy in particular, I felt that, the issue is not how much money. The issue is things like energy prices, what should be subsidies, where should change price, all this kind of stuff. And I said that we should be able to take a note on energy policy the cabinet. Now, as a normal rule, you only take a note for a subject which you've been assigned. And energy was split between 5 or 6 different ministries. Ministry of Power, Ministry of Coal, Ministry of Petroleum, Ministry of Renewable Energy, all these different guys. Each one had his own ministry. Each one was submitted a note on his proposal. I said that, look, we need a unified note from the Planning Commission, which takes the composite view. So that was the first time ever that the Planning Commission, in fact, what I did, I asked Kirit Parekh to set up a group and come up with an energy policy recommendation. That report was submitted and published. Then the Planning Commission kept referring to the report as the energy policy. I said, look, this is not the energy policy, it's a report on energy policy. To make it energy policy, we must take it to the cabinet and get the cabinet to approve it. And Dr. Manmohan Singh agreed that, okay, you take this thing to the cabinet. It turned out that there were so many recommendations covering different ministries. He set up a group of ministers under Pranab Mukherjee to review each of them. We had a series of meetings. But the group never took a firm decision on any of these things that were controversial. It referred it to the ministry to come back with a proposal. So actually nothing happened. So there's no question that the Planning Commission needed to be changed, and we were trying to do some change. I have no idea what has happened since then. Only thing I know is that the Niti Aayog does not have any responsibility for giving money. But technically, if they have the responsibility for policy, in my view, that's very important. But I don't know whether they have that. Today's newspaper has a very interesting story, which is the exact opposite of what Arvind will remember. Because it says that a notice has been issued by Niti Aayog instructing everybody in Niti Aayog cannot publish op-ed without getting the approval of the top management. Now, to my mind, you can't run a think tank on that basis. In fact, the correct thing, which is what we used to do, you just say that this is your view, and it does not necessarily reflect the view of the Planning Commission. That's how you stimulate ideas.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Montek, that's been a great discussion on this matter. I'm just going to wear one cryptic sentence and leave it that without, I by and large agree with you. The comment I have, which is something I learned about, little bit about institutional economics, it is that it is easy to eliminate institutions, very difficult to create new ones. With that, I want to wind up this this very fascinating. We've had 2 hours of very, very good discussions. As anybody who's left, I think many people, it was got a little long, but sorry for that. But it's been a great discussion. And that's exactly why we invited you. And we are so happy and pleased that you came. It was exactly so that there could be a little bit of discussion, debate between a senior person like you and, as I said, technical economist like me who was involved in, at least 50% of the things which you did in the finance ministry while I was there. So thank you very much. And with that,
thank you.
Hand it over to Charan to conclude the overall.
Yeah, I must thank both of you because the discussion was really very participative, and I really want to thank Mr. Montek for having agreed to come. And I'm sure the thoughts that we have heard from him and of course his views have benefited all of us. And I'm sure he also has gone down the memory lane and with hindsight probably discussed some of the issues. I must mention that this was pretty historical as far as I am concerned. And India's economic growth story would be incomplete without the discussion that we have had today. So I'm going to be sending it to all my friends in the government and in other think tanks. We will be having the recording of it available to us by noon tomorrow. I'll send to everybody, and I hope you can also share it with others, because many policy issues have come out of the discussion today. Many fresh ideas have come out from the discussion today, and specifically, I like the idea of the research wing in the direct taxes, the issue which you have brought out, sir. It's very, very interesting. Next week,
just one question. One question. Did you say you're going to send around some written account, or just put this on the website?
No, we are just going to share the recording on the web if you are comfortable.
Fair enough.
Yeah? So just that. And next week, Friday, we have Aliso Terzi, an economist at the European Commission, speaking to us about growth for good. And that is where he brings in the story of the climate change. It is reshaping capitalism to save humanity from climate catastrophe. I think it's a very interesting discussion we'll have again next week, and the climate comes in. So I would invite all of you to be there.
Thanks a lot.
And for today,
Bye-bye.
Today, once again, let me thank both Mr. Montek Ahluwalia and Dr. Virmani to have shared these thoughts with us.
Thanks very much. Thanks for
Thank you.
Bye.